Okay, so don't say anything that you don't want available for eternity. Uh, how you doing, Jim? You're muted. You're muted.
Uh, uh,
Now
pretty,
you are unmuted.
pretty well. I can probably last the meeting.
Okay, I don't think we're gonna go beyond 8 because there's just, as I said in my email, not that many things have popped up. But who knows? Who knows? As always, jump in or wave your hand or whatever. Don't wait for my pauses, because if I get long-winded, they may be a long time between pauses. Um, so we've just begun the year 5785. Um, and let's take a look at that number. Turns out that there was a Mesopotamian calendar promulgated in the city that came to be called Nippur, but at that time it was Nibriki. We'll get into that name soon. But in Nibriki, according to the tablets, and this is mostly the king lists, the lists of the kings and the wars, okay, that calendar was authorized, promulgated in the year 3760 BCE by the king of Nibiru, An. Now, as we'll find out later, he probably wasn't available on site at that time. But somehow that was the date when the calendar began. And it's conjectural, and it was something that Sitchin thought was a fact. For him, it was good enough, that An, who promulgated the calendar, his name may be the source of the root word in Latin for year, annum. And An means the heavenly one. So that's one of many honorific names, and that's the one that got used a lot in the tablets, and that's what we tend to use in translation, An, the heavenly one. But his name really means heaven or heavenly one, as in Anunnaki, on the people from heaven who are on key earth. So 3760 BCE. If you add 2024 Common Era, CE, you get 5784. Now, the Hebrew year, I just said, just became 5785. So that suggests very strongly that the ancient Jewish calendar was really the same as the Mesopotamian calendar that started in that place at that time. From what we know of the ancient calendar, it's almost unchanged in the modern Hebrew calendar. The same names of the months, same number of months, the same system of having a leap month instead of a leap year. Every once in a while, I forget how often that is, but one of the months gets repeated every, I'm not sure how many years it is, but to keep the solar and the lunar cycles coordinated. So the calendar was promulgated in the city called Nibriki. Now that was the headquarters of Enlil. That was his main temple was there. I mean, he was also the god in the main city, Ur. But Nibriki was his center. That's where the equipment was, the beacons for keeping contact with Nibiru. Um, Something about Toledo, Spain. So anyway,
I just wanted you to see this because it reminded me of the Enki and Ian depicting half fish, half human so many times because the reptilian aspect. I just got back from Spain and I saw several pictures of basically mermaid humans, which I think stems from ancient times.
yeah, well, maybe we'll come around to that later this evening. Um, uh, Now, Nibriki translates to the crossing point of Earth because Nibiru is the planet that crosses. Okay, um, and Nibriki means the crossing point of Earth or the connection between Nibiru and Earth. You know, it's got to do with that connection. Now, it can't be coincidence that the name of the Jewish people in their own ancient language in Hebrew is Hebrew. So if the people are the Hebrew, it strongly suggests, and this was Sitchin's conclusion, that they came from Nibriki. You know, that's where they had origin. And it is known, well, it is stated in Genesis that Abraham's father, Terah, was a priest of the chief god of Ur, who was Enlil, who was the big deal in Nibriki. So that's all. That all gets tied together in a very interesting way. Now, was On actually on site? Doesn't seem so, because from the tablets information, including an unexpected solar eclipse, it appears that the last not particularly eventful passage of Nibiru was in 556 BCE. And if you go back one orbit of Nibiru, if you go back 3,600 years, you wind up at 4,156 BCE, which is around 400 years before the promulgation of that calendar. So it doesn't seem likely that On was actually there for some kind of ceremony when it was promulgated. He did it from afar. So and by the way, you know, Hebrew is the English is the English way of saying Hebrew. You know, and I guess we can go on to the next thing, and again, just say Happy New Year. Okay. The other big thing that's going on, besides the Jewish New Year, is the election. And the one thing that is striking, you know, is how, you know, in recent history, you know, tyranny has taken over in nations where people were impoverished, frightened, despondent, the post-World War One Germany, China, where the mass of people were in pretty awful conditions for a long time. And what we're seeing here is a nation within the nation, a nation of people who are relatively, maybe not impoverished, but not doing as well and often downwardly mobile, and frightened about what their future looks like. And they are in that position because they are, you might say, differently skilled. These are not folks who are working with electronic digits. They are working with the digits of their hands, and they have been to a great extent left out. Now, industrial policy that has been launched recently, may improve their lot enormously, and manufacturing may come back in a big way, but we have to survive until that happens, and the vast middle of the country, gets lifted up. In the meantime, in the electorate, there's this huge number of people who have a hunger for a powerful, protective, godlike, anointed figure, much like the Anunnaki lords, the original model for civilization. And they're, very, very vulnerable to being to a brainwashed kind of allegiance. What we've talked about in a few of these forums, has been, I've called it I call it automatic deference, a trait that is only found in humans, and that is to become the leader only because you act like the leader. If you expect to be deferred to, people start automatically deferring to, which is not the way it happens for lions and chimpanzees. They earn leadership, okay? And there's a question whether to have this trait was just a goof, an unintentional defect that came about through the Anunnaki genetic manipulation of Homo erectus, or whether it was an intentionally induced trait so that they would have more willing servant slaves. The good news about it is that it's not true of indigenous peoples. Their leadership is earned. And if you're not worthy, all of a sudden, you're no longer in charge. So, if what we see in civilization is the presence of this trait, apparently it's possible to learn to suppress it. It is possible, whether how much epigenetics is involved, how much it's a matter of cultural overlay, how much it's a matter of breeding out those people who have this very undesirable trait, because clearly this is not a great adaptation. Any society that, or any entity, any social entity that is led by people who haven't earned the right to leadership, but have it because their father was rich, or their father was the king, and they have no other qualifications. They're headed for trouble. And that's a nation, that's a company, that's a military organization. Incompetent leadership leads to disaster. And an undesirable trait being bred out, there's evidence for that. That's why there's very little alcoholism in the Mediterranean peoples. Because they had wine for so long, so many thousands of years, that those who couldn't deal with it got bred out. They didn't reproduce as successfully. You know? At least that's the theory, and it seems like it makes sense. So hopefully, we'll stumble through this one by the skin of our teeth. Sane people will be in charge, and the industrialization, or you might say industrialism, which is taking root again, will lift up the people who are feeling so beaten down and deprived, and there won't be the fertile ground for tyranny. Fingers crossed. Speaking of problematic traits, I recommend the movie which I just saw, and I don't think it's going to have a long theater run, but I'm sure it's going to be available streaming, and that's Megalopolis. It's not to everybody's taste. It's not got good reviews. It's got too many themes, too many layers of meaning. It was Francis Ford Coppola's brainchild. He's been stewing this vision for about 40 years, they say. And so he's writer, director, producer, and did it all. He did it all with his own treasure. Anyway, one of the messages in Megalopolis, and it's stated explicitly. I mean, it's implicit, but it's also stated explicitly by one of the main characters, the visionary architect. And what he says is, it's civilization itself which is destroying humankind. Civilization is the problem. Okay, and it doesn't seem like it can be overcome without fairly ruthless defeat of civilization.
Well, excuse me,
Yeah.
Mike,
Yes,
is civilization in contrast to what?
in contrast to the indigenous way of life.
Oh, okay.
And I mean, his vision, this architect whose first name, by the way, is Caesar. Well, it's a lot of Roman names, and Coppola, who's in love with in New York. A lot of it's shot in New York, but New York is New Rome in the movie, which is pretty good. I mean, obviously, New York is a lot closer to being a new Rome, than a New York, England. It's great seeing the cars. The graphics on the cars is exactly the same as the New York City police graphics, except it's NRPD. And he's in love with the Chrysler Building, which all true New Yorkers are. The architect's studio is up in the tower of the Art Nouveau tower of the Chrysler Building, and so this is this tension between the representative of civilization, the mayor and his cronies and the big banker and all of that, versus the visionary architect who is seeing a utopia that is built physically with some magical material that he got the Nobel Prize for inventing. I mean, it's lots of impossibilities. That character has the ability to stop time. He can freeze time, everything stops, and then he has to start in again. And so it's got all kinds of wild themes. But you know, one of his principles that he keeps saying several times, keeps articulating, that it's less important what we're actually doing now. You know, it's thinking about it, it's envisioning it, it's looking ahead. That's the most important thing. If we think about it and we put our minds to it, that's what's going to make the change, not, you know, the law that we're going to pass today, you know, or the building project we're going to start today. Um, which actually, you know, is perfectly in fitting with the role of the architect, because people, you know, people tend to think, well, architects make buildings. No, 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 no. Architects, builders make buildings, contractors make buildings. Architects make drawings. Architects, you know, have the image. They create the image. They create the vision. You know, so that's what this character in the movie is saying is important for humanity as a whole, to have the vision. Have the vision of what you want, what you can be, and that's really all you need. So that's you know, I recommend seeing it on the big screen, but it'll be I don't know how it will translate to the small screen. But it's not very popular. I went to an afternoon show and there were 3 of us in the theater. Um, now, this next thing I want to introduce has a fairly tenuous connection to our thinking, our ongoing discussion, and it's because um, the Big Bang Theory is a primary example of, to my mind, you know, of a metaphysical, philosophical attitude overcoming the actual physical facts. Because the facts, if looked at objectively, do not support the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory is a necessity if you posit that there is no prime mover, that there is no ether, there is no infinite intelligence in the field, you know, that space is totally empty except for spare atoms once in a while. Space is totally empty and a total void and totally dumb. Okay. And in order to account for the drop in the color of light coming from the most distant objects, you know, you have to invent the Big Bang. Now, I'm very, very, and there is accumulating evidence that's been building up that this theory is not holding together, you know. For example, some of the very, very most distant objects, which according to the theory were of the old, were present and created, you know, in the first micro nanoseconds of existence. But some of those very distant objects are galaxies that take billions of years to evolve. So how could something which is billions of years old have been created in the first few nanoseconds of existence, of physical existence? Anyway, it's things like that that are making the theory come apart. So what I'm very curious to see is whether this new experiment that's just been started is going to further undercut um, the Big Bang Theory and what it's the deep underground neutrino experiment, and they're shooting neutrinos from the Fermilab in Chicago to a site deep underground in the Black Hills of North Dakota. Okay, they're creating neutrinos, which are virtually mass-free entities. And what's what makes me think that gotta find out something that they almost don't want to find out, because a very, very convincing idea to me is that the neutrinos have a lot to do with the physical reality underlying astrologic phenomena. And we do know that the Anunnaki were astrologers. They were working with what happens on this planet as a result of what happens in the solar system. And the only theory that I've encountered that makes sense of the motion of the planets and astrologic realities is that the information is coming into us, into our non-genetic DNA carried by the neutrinos. So let's see if I find some things in this deep underground neutrino experiment, DUNE. Interesting. It's called Dune. That like stay tuned. Let's see what comes out of this experiment. A few things from one of our favorite scientists, Avi Loeb. You know what he's catching hell for? There was a meteor or asteroid that came into the atmosphere not too long ago. I don't know how many years ago. And by its track, its speed was such that it came from outside the galaxy. It was, in other words, it came in at unbelievable velocity. Okay, so he reasoned, well, let's look at what sheared off from that object as it disintegrated in the atmosphere. And so he followed the track in the Pacific, and he dragged a sled along the track of this object to see what might be there, and they've been picking up tiny, tiny spherules of metal, little globular things, and some of them are two fused spheres together. Anyway, their metallurgical composition is such that they have to be the product of manufacturing. That that body, carried material from some advanced civilization somewhere outside the galaxy. And of course, he's getting hell for that. But he's got a pretty broad mind. So he published an article that positing that life as we know it can survive and it can be transplanted, but it's logically going to happen digitally. In other words, we're going to record our code, and we're going to transplant that. Eventually, we'll be able to transplant that to some friendly environment, maybe after we've destroyed this one enough. But we'll be able to plant our seed, somewhere else digitally. Now, that appears to be exactly what happened with the flood. I mean, the dumbed down version in Genesis is Noah collecting pairs of animals to to reproduce life after the land dried up. But what's in the Mesopotamian versions of the flood story is that he took the seeds of life. And that character goes by different names in the different cultures that this whole series of flood stories. So he was Utnapishtim and Ziusudra and Atrahasis, and in Genesis he's Noah. But the Mesopotamian versions have him taking the seeds of life, which makes sense because he was a servant of Enki, the chief scientist. So yeah, he would have given him genetic material. Maybe not in digital form. Maybe it was genetic material in in vitro form, in vivo form. But anyway, uh, um, but that's exactly what seems to have happened when so much of the earth was inundated. Um, he also, in that article, Loeb talked about how we know we have a lot of confidence in what we think we know, and we really shouldn't, you know. And what he used as a good example for that was Plato's allegory of the cave from the Republic, where the people are looking at shadows on a wall, and they're taking that as reality. That's all they see. That's all they know as these shadows. But what's actually happening is that there's a bright light, there's a sun behind them, that they don't know about, and that sun is casting the shadows of the actual reality, and the people are deceiving themselves or they are deceived to think that what they are witnessing is what's really real. And he points that to a lot of our scientific, a lot of our science, um, uh, scientific laws, which really are not based. They're not good. They're not really true good science. They're just scientish, uh, science-like. Uh, um, uh, by the way, the Republic, which is really well worth reading in its entirety, but Plato seems to conclude that there really isn't any form of civilized governance. He goes through all of them, that has a chance of really long-term stability. Every one of them has some fatal flaw that leads to dissolution or tyranny or chaos. Um, uh, and so that parallels the theme in Megalopolis, that civilization, as we understand it, as we have formulated, doesn't work. And that's because it was the gift of the gods. And the gods from Nibiru were in a rigid, highly structured, traumatized civilization that had adapted to repeated traumatization of their world. And they had adapted to violence and war and and fixation on treasure, on material goods, um, um, and a civilization dependent on exploitation and lower ranks serving the higher ranks. Um, um, and so, yeah, that doesn't work that well. Um, and the salvation, should it come, is really going to be modeling communal life on the life of the indigenous peoples of the world, where there's true self-rule, sustainable self-rule. Um, he's an optimistic guy. He says that he's optimistic about AI. And he says that it's really going to facilitate a qualitative revolution in human life, and and that uh, and that our cultural evolution is going to be substantially affected when we have um, more significant contact with advanced extraterrestrials. You think that's inevitable? But we have now very fleeting and superficial contact, which is mostly dismissed. But he said he thinks eventually there's going to be some real fertilization, at least of ideas and concepts um, from far away. Because those, if the matter isn't settled by then, I can very well imagine some advanced beings coming down and saying, well, of course you're a hybrid species. It's obvious. Anybody can see that. Um, and if they're advanced enough, I guess we'll believe them. Now, one of the mysteries, it doesn't have much of a, so far it hasn't had much of a logical explanation, given the framework of conventional thought, that Grace was referring to, that all the images of fish people, mermen, um, um, and in the tablets and the carvings, images of a man wearing a fish costume. It doesn't look like Halloween. It looks like it's much more serious. But he's draped in a fish skin. And thing is, well, what's that about? We only have images. There's no textual reference to why it keeps showing this mixture of fish and man. And here's my contribution to that, and it's in the chapter in Evolution Diverted entitled "The Aquatic Ape." I'll skip the details. I think we've gone into them in much earlier forums, but there's enormous evidence that we had a period of marine adaptation, that we were the aquatic ape. And the evidence is very, very strong in behavior and in physiology and in anatomy. Just, well, I'll skip over all of the evidence. I refer you to that chapter because I go into it in detail. And the theory was developed, I think, in the 1920s, of the aquatic ape. And and it had fervent followers, but most of science dismissed it. And the main reason for that is that there's no fossil record of a time when hominins like us, lived in water, like a warm, shallow sea, you know. Um, and by contrast, there is very, very clear fossil record of creatures that went from land mammals to marine mammals and then came back on land and lived on land and are now living on land and have retained some of their marine adaptations. Primary ones that we know, the elephants and the hippos. Um, and if we went through the same sequence of land to marine life back to land, why are we missing the records? Because those sites where we transition ought to be around. And my suggestion is that that fossil record doesn't exist on Earth because it exists on Nibiru. And we have the aquatic adaptations that came with the component of the Anunnaki genes that they put into our genome. My guess is that it was a package deal because because they clearly wanted servants who looked kind of like them, who were relatively hairless instead of furry, who stood up straight rather than bent over, and those are, of course, are traits which help with swimming. So it's possible that those desirable traits came along with ones that were not particularly relevant, but were linked in the genome, and that's how we inherited the Anunnaki's interest in water. They landed first in one of those environments where their remote ancestors on Nibiru would have transitioned from land to water to land, and that is the Great Marsh at the head of the Persian Gulf, with the Euphrates and what's the other river? There's a huge marsh at the head of the Gulf, and they chose to live near that marsh for a very, very long time before moving inland. And they moved in a generally northwesterly direction up in the land between the rivers, Tigris and Euphrates. So I think that's what's being expressed, in the fish imagery, the man-fish imagery. Like, yeah, we're aware of, and we're honoring that phase in our evolutionary development. Um, um, because, we're the only primate that likes water, with one exception. The bonobos like water, but they are like us in many ways. They're closer than the chimpanzees to us in terms of their behavior. So, well, I think that's behind the imagery that Grace was talking about. That she had saw examples of. And that's as much as came to mind this last month. It wasn't, often there's like almost a dozen different things developing in science and developing in human culture that relates to diverted evolution, but only a few. But I thought it might be a good idea to keep the momentum up and meet this month anyway. And next, let's see. Gosh, next month be biting our nails. Be so close. Actually, it'll be. I guess I don't know that we want to meet that day. But we'll have to think. I have to think about it as we get closer. But that Monday is going to be the day before Election Day. Um,
Better than election day itself.
oh well, yeah. But I'll have to be getting my beauty rest because I'll have a very long day at the poll the next day.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, gotta be there before. Well, poll opens at 7, so some preparation the night before, and gotta be there well before 6.
Oof.
Be there 5:30, and wrap everything up if you're lucky by 10 at night.
You're doing the whole shift?
Yeah,
Oh,
well, I take senior privilege, and I sneak home for a nap in the middle of the day.
oh, good. Okay.
And things in the mid-afternoon, things quiet down. So there's a rush in the morning, and then there's a rush
Yep.
after work. Okay. But in order to have an essentially foolproof system, which is true in our county, Delaware County, Pennsylvania. To have a foolproof system, it is quite complicated. So both technically and procedurally, it's it's belt and suspenders, dotting all I's, crossing all T's, very, very methodical. That's the price of having it be foolproof. So there are provisional ballots for those who, for one reason or another, don't really have the ability to vote that day, and there's a paper ballot that is saved. The information goes in digitally. But also the digital information gets printed out. It's belt, suspenders, and I don't know what other gear works to keep pants up, but that's what we're doing. God help us.
Gotta attempt to keep the democracy alive.
Pardon?
Gotta attempt to keep the democracy alive.
Yes, the representative government really isn't democracy, but and Plato thought that democracy is one of the worst forms, pure democracy, the rule by the masses, one of the worst things you can have. So did Hamilton.
Well, it beats autocracy.
Yes.
Mike, weren't almost all of the American founders actually scared of what they considered to be mob rule?
Yes, wisely scared.
Yeah,
Um,
but in those days, the difference between an educated person, so-called, and an uneducated person, their competency levels were vastly different.
yes, the level of education, but the one thing that was a huge advantage then was that even though the masses, hadn't read Montesquieu um, and John Locke, um, they were literate and they were reading newspapers and pamphlets and they were in constant conversation about how we should rule ourselves, how government should work. Um, and that was astounding to visitors from Europe, how much of how widespread was the conversation about governance. Um, well, we've come close to disaster, absolute total disaster several times. Uh, Always seem to stumble through like the British. Maybe we'll stumble through it this time again. Um, But it is a time globally of a great deal of darkness and pain. But the truth will set us free, and that's what I, for one, am working on. Okay, I've run out of subject matter, and we are running out of time. So thank you all for being here. And I'll come up with, we may have to, maybe we should reconvene in 2 months. I'll think about it. Make us, anybody who wants to contribute to that decision, just feel free to get in touch with me about it. But I know we can't meet the day before election day and
Why is that? Why is that? But why wouldn't we?
it would just we'll be too distracted and I need my rest.
I need the distraction.
Ah. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Good, yeah, well, I think you'll just need another source of distraction, Reeve. I don't,
get
I,
that.
I don't think our forum can provide that.
You know, the early Zionists had the same problem with democracy. They said if we let all those masses vote and run the government, we have no Zionism. They knew from the beginning that it would have to be a gradual, somehow developing thing, but but giving the masses like Plato is a big mistake sometimes. Sometimes some sort of elite or some sort of advanced people have to seize it and bring democracy very slowly into play. Anyway, I just thought it would, the Zionists had the same problem, that's all I'm saying.
Well, everybody, every civilized, every civilized uh, society that's tried to design things are the same issue. And Plato thought that the greatest, possibility for success was aristocracy. If somehow you could keep the educated elite, working for everybody, not just for themselves, not working to enrich themselves and moving it, towards oligarchy. But if it was a true aristocracy, perhaps led by a philosopher king, you know, that had the greatest chance of benefiting the world. Um, and that was, largely built into the original. That was what was behind the idea of the electoral college. That was what was behind the non-popular election of the upper house of Congress. The Senate was
Simba?
the Senate was voted in by the state legislatures. And it was not one man, one vote. There were property requirements, so that you could vote if you had a stake in the outcome of governance. So we would definitely not a democracy. Made Tom Jefferson unhappy, but he was a great Democrat in theory. Um, yeah. Um, uh, um, there was I just read a compendium of jokes that came out of the Soviet Union, and one of them was Soviet technocrats were visiting the temple of capitalism of the plant of the Ford Motor Company, and this seeing this highly efficient operation going, and they said, well, yeah, it works in practice, but does it work in theory?
That's good.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay, blessings. I'll be in touch.
Thank you, Mike.
Right, thank you, Mike. Have a happy new year, son. It's all about good everything happening. Good year next year. This year, good year.
Good year this year. Good night.